if you think of South Africa, you'd probably think of safaris and wild animals and Cape Town and the mountain. But South Africa is also very well known for something called Biltong. Now, Biltong has been around for many years, and originally it was invented as a way to preserve meat for the purposes of survival. It was obviously before the time where we had things like refrigerators and freezers. So we really needed to find ways to preserve meat effectively, and nowadays it's a delicacy and it's something that's fairly expensive. The purpose of this video then is to really give people a reference guide, something where they can come back to and review and watch over and over again, so that they really understand the process behind how to make biltong, how to go about making it, how to hang it, how to dry it, what you need to look out for, things that you need to consider, and obviously the different kind of recipes. Now, there is no right and a wrong way to make biltong, essentially, from a theoretical perspective, and that also includes your ingredients. There is no certain things have to be there. Yes, there are traditional recipes that you can follow, and there's lots of them on the internet. You just need to go and find what works for you. The purpose of this video is to almost give you a how-to guide of what you should look out for and what you should potentially consider, and really to make life easier for people. As a butcher, as an assessor, a moderator, a person who owns a training business, I'm also using this as a platform to showcase what we do as a business and how we help people, individuals from a training perspective, businesses from a training perspective, but also as consultants all over the world who help people and consider things that people battle with on a day-to-day basis. We help to turn businesses around. We help to make businesses a little bit more profitable. We help from a health and safety compliance perspective. We essentially keep people out of jail. So, it's one of those, it's a very discussed topic, and more and more people from all over the world are making their own biltong, and there's a lot of questions that come about. I've been involved in many hobbies, and every time you start a new hobby, it's like you being thrown into the deep end, and you try and figure out what you need to do and what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and what should I buy and what should I not buy, and there's so many different options out there, and a hobby can really become so expensive that it's ultimately it's not worth your while anymore. So as somebody who's very money conscious, I'm going to give you a couple of options of how to do or how to go about making your own biltong. And if you want to do it on a commercial level, obviously you're going to have to scale up and change things up a little bit. But for the most part, it's for the new person who wants to understand the process. It's for the hobbyist who wants to really understand what goes into the process, and just to see whether they enjoy making it or not. It's one of those things where you'll only know once you start. So again, the video is there, it's a reference, it's there to help people. If there are any questions or comments or queries, feel free to leave them in the comment section. And if there's enough queries that are similar, I'll potentially make a follow-up video to address those issues. There's always the question of humidity or temperature, or should I use heat versus no heat, that type of thing. And everybody has their own preference, and it also depends on where you find yourself in the world. So enjoy the video, and I'd greatly appreciate your feedback, and tell me whether this helped you and added any value in your life and in your journey to start making your own biltong. So enjoy.
For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be using a silver side to do the demonstration. The silver side is also called the round or the round steak. I'm not going to discuss the silver side at length, I have a separate video of how to trim or dress the silver side and how to split the different muscle groups. Some people might comment and say the cut hasn't been trimmed or dressed correctly or sufficiently, but in reality it all depends on how you want to go about it. You can either trim or dress before you start cutting, but inevitably you will have to trim or dress when you start cutting your slices. So it all depends on you. As I'm about to demonstrate, you want to be cutting with the grain of the meat. This will give you the long strips that present very well, and it will also stay intact as it's busy drying out. When looking at this eye of the silver side, you can see that if you were to cut against the grain, you would end up with almost wheel-shaped pieces of biltong, and that's not necessarily what you want. Now I'm going to demonstrate how you go about cutting the slices for biltong. What you don't want to do is use a backwards and forwards motion as if you're cutting bread. What you do want to have is ultimate control over the meat, and you can use your hand as a guide as demonstrated. Alternatively, you could cut from the opposite side. You need to figure out what is comfortable for you, and the purpose of this video is not to teach anybody knife skills. I'm going to make the first cut, and as you can see, it's one single motion when you start applying pressure. If you don't cut all the way through, you can split the meat, but make sure that you don't have any jagged edges when you're done cutting. The thickness of the cut will depend on you. It also depends on how long you want to wait before the biltong is dry. The thinner you cut, the quicker it'll dry, and the thicker you cut, obviously, the longer it'll take to dry out. The area in which you find yourself in will also largely depend on how thick or thin you need to cut your biltong slices. Naturally, because thicker slices take longer to dry out, you would not want to cut thick slices in a very humid environment. You want to try and go as thin as possible because humidity has a direct effect on the drying process of the meat. A good technique to practice is to open your free hand as much as you can to make sure that none of your fingers end up under the blade, especially when you start applying pressure when cutting the meat. The sizing of your slices will also once again depend on where you are. Sometimes you might want to split your slices in half because it makes it easier to manage, makes it easier to handle, and it also helps dry out the meat a little bit faster. Unfortunately, my studio acoustics isn't conducive to making videos. The audio is a little bit hollow. This video was shot in front of an audience, and therefore there is a difference between the voiceover and the hand gestures. In the beginning of this video, I made reference to the trimming or the dressing of the silver side. This piece of meat can either be used as biltong or you could use it for trimmings for other products, but it all depends on you. And that's why I said the trimming really depends on what you want to do. If you are going to display the meat or the biltong, then obviously you want to have it look as good as possible. If you only do it for home consumption, there's nothing wrong with taking the uglier cuts and turning them into biltong. What you do want to make sure of is that there are no jagged edges on any one of your pieces of meat that will eventually become biltong. because you don't want to give flies or bluebottles the opportunity to hide in between any jagged edges and lay their eggs. Unfortunately, this is meat, it's a reality, and you're going to have to make a plan to eliminate these issues as far as possible. Here you can see the differences in thickness. Obviously the one on the left will dry out a lot faster than the one on the right. Now we get to the part where you can really let your creativity go. In South Africa, we're very fortunate in that we can buy biltong spice pre-mixed and ready to use. You might not have the same luxury. This is where, once again, you can really start getting creative with what you put in your spices or your spice mix. Traditional biltong has a strong coriander flavor, but it's really up to you as to what you want to put into your mix. Sea salt makes a good base for your spice mix. You can balance it with brown sugar, and pepper also helps to balance the flavors. But in general, it's really up to you as to what goes into your spice mix. If you're looking for recipes, there are tons of them on the internet. And again, there is no right and wrong. It's all about personal preference and taste. Unfortunately, it's one of those situations where you have to go through the trial and error phases to find out what works best for you. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm using a pre-mixed biltong spice. The recipe requires 45 to 50 grams of spice per every 1 kilogram of meat. And that's why you want to make sure that you keep your calculations as accurate as possible. Start off by weighing all the meat to enable you to do the calculation as to how much spice you need to use. Once you know how much meat you have, you can then calculate how much spice you would need to complete the process. As part of this demonstration, I'm going to be explaining to you how you would go about making biltong if you were to do it for yourself or on a really small scale. I'm also going to take you through the process of doing it on a larger scale or a more commercial scale. Adding vinegar to the mix is not an absolute requirement, but it does help in the curing process. It also helps to dissolve some of the salts and the spices, and it aids in the penetration of these salts and spices into the meat. For a stronger flavor profile, you could also add some Worcester sauce to the mix. A question that will come up though is how much liquid should you add to your spice mix? A simple solution to managing the liquids as part of your spice mix is to use an empty water bottle. Punch a few holes in the cap and use it as a spray bottle as you layer the meat. How you spice your meat is entirely up to you. I prefer to start off with some spices and liquid at the bottom of the tray before I start adding any of the meat. Make sure that you have good coverage of spices and liquid on all pieces of meat. This will aid in the curing process, and it also helps from a flavor profile perspective. I like to make sure that I have good coverage with the majority of the spices. Thereafter, I start adding the balance and massage the spice mix into the meat. Whilst this process works really well, you would want to keep your meat overnight in the fridge to make sure that you have good penetration of spices and liquids. Once you are comfortable with how long you've marinated the meat, you can then start preparing to hang it. This method is perfect for people who make biltong on a smaller scale. For a more commercial application, you might want to consider using a tumbler or a tumbling machine. When using a tumbling machine, the difference is you can take your meat slices, you can put it into the machine, add your spices and your liquids, close it up, start it, and by the time it's done, after about 20 minutes, your meat is ready to hang. Here you can see the tumbling machine in action. take a step back to the manual method of marinating the meat. A lot of people don't necessarily have access to biltong hooks, so here is a handy tip. If you're in a bind, take a paperclip, open it up, and it serves as a biltong hook just as well as any commercial biltong hook. Next up, you need to hang the biltong. If you live in an area which is very humid, like at the coast or somewhere where it rains often, you might want to consider introducing heat. For that, you would need a biltong cabinet. Anything will work as long as it can contain some heat and obviously there's airflow. If you live in an area where it's relatively dry, just normal airflow or alternatively a fan could work perfectly depending on the season. In general though, a strong enough fan will make sure that you have enough airflow to prevent mold from growing on your biltong, and it also speeds up the drying process.
And there you have it. It's a fairly basic instructional guide of how to make biltong, and it's something that you can do in your own kitchen. You don't need any specialized equipment or anything special really. What I do want to add though is I think it's important for you to consult a number of recipes and to try and get an idea of what needs to be in your recipes and in your spice mix, and how you will go about preserving the meat in such a way that it's effective from a preserving and a curing perspective, but it's also sufficient from a flavor and a flavor profile perspective. A lot of people ask, how do I, for example, add chilies and how do I add different flavors? Now, my suggestion is always start with a good base and work from there. Once you are comfortable with your base, in my opinion, it's better to make the biltong and then add anything else that you want afterwards. The problem that you have is, in a lot of cases, spices aren't always very consistent. If you have a good recipe and you start and you stick to that recipe and you have a fairly consistent product coming out at the end, you can always add chilies, for example. You can buy 2 batches of chilies, one will burn, one won't. So if you add the chilies and you have a taste as you add the chilies, you can get to a flavor profile that you want, and it's a good quality product. A lot of people ask the question, how do I know when the biltong is ready? Now, it's one of those things that you can't really get wrong unless you leave it for too long and it dries out completely. Because if it's too wet, it's simple. You just leave it for a little bit longer. If it's too dry, unfortunately, there's nothing you can do to rehydrate it, and you'll have to live with that batch until it's finished. But a good way of going about it is every day, take one of your pieces and cut off the bottom. Just cut 1 or 2 small slices and check and see if you're happy with it. And obviously, the best part of making biltong is the tasting part. So as you check it, as you taste it, you'll start finding what works for you and where you are most comfortable from a product perspective. Like I said earlier in the video, vinegar is not an absolute requirement. It does help in the curing process, and it does also help to dissolve some of the spices. It helps with that penetration. You'll see that with the tumbling machine, if you ever use one, all the liquids that you have at the bottom of your traditional packing method, the one I showed earlier, none of that liquid is left over in the tumbler. So all of that spices and liquids have been absorbed. So the vinegar was always a good idea. Again, if you want a different flavor profile, you can add some Worcester sauce to it. There's actually so much that you can do that the possibilities are endless. You can make strips, for example, small little strips, and that'll obviously dry very quickly. So those will give you your biltong sticks or whatever you want to call it. So there's no end to what you can do in terms of a spice and a flavor profile, as long as you use a good quality meat and you make sure that your slices are cut uniformly. You'll also get a very uniform looking product, and it obviously dries very consistently. Some people will ask, do I have to use the silver side? And the answer is no. You can use essentially any cut that you want that will give you large enough strips to make biltong. You could, for example, use the strip loin for biltong if you would want to, especially on an older animal. If you look at a C grade, and I'll make a separate video on the grading of carcasses, and I'll give you an idea of the ages of the animals. But a C grade in South Africa is fairly scarce, and it's very popular because it's got that nice yellow fat on it. If you don't like any fat whatsoever, you could potentially use the cut called a thick flank. You could also use the top side. So you don't have to use the silver side. It's one of those, it's the go-to cut when it comes to biltong. Everybody wants it, everybody uses it. And unfortunately, because of that supply and demand issue, silver side also tends to be a little bit more expensive. So if you're willing to look around and you're willing to try other cuts, you could potentially find something that's a little bit cheaper for you. I quickly want to talk about the pricing of biltong. Now, I said earlier in the video that biltong, it tends to be very expensive. It is a delicacy, although it's available in every single butchery in South Africa. It's available in every single supermarket. And the reason why it's expensive is because you take meat and you essentially dehydrate it. And because you dehydrate it, you end up losing weight because you lose moisture. So if you, for example, take a cut that costs you $10 or 10 Rand, for argument's sake, once you made the biltong, you've obviously added spices, you've added liquids, so you have added value to it, and that in itself allows you to charge a little bit more for your product, because that's the general rule of thumb, is once you start adding value, you can also charge more for what you made. The problem with biltong again is because you lose moisture and you lose weight, you end up losing money if you don't make provision for it and charge accordingly. So in theory, what you could do is and again, now what you need to do is, as you make your biltong, you need to go and weigh it every day to try and figure out from a relatively scientific perspective, where your best balance is from a drying versus costing perspective. So if you weigh it every day and you end up, let's say for argument's sake, after 3 days, you've lost 50% of the weight, then in theory, you need to take whatever the batch cost you, and you need to take that price and double it just to get to that same break-even point. And thereafter, you start adding your margins and so on. So it's something that you would need to work out for yourself. It's something that you need to also keep an eye out for if anybody else around you is selling biltong. If you charge 100 Rand or $100 a kilo, you can't be charging double that of what your neighbor is charging, or the shop across the street, or down around the corner. So you also need to be very mindful in terms of how you price your products from a selling perspective, but then also to make sure that you sell it and you make a profit if you were to want to go that route. But again, it's easy enough. Take the meat every day, weigh it, and you obviously have your initial weight because you worked it out with your spices, and then see what is your best balance between dry weight and flavor. You can look at an average of about anything between 40 and 50% weight loss or moisture loss, and that will give you a relatively average, decent quality product that the majority of people will buy. Some people do like it a little bit drier, so my advice is always to cut your biltong, and you can always put it out. Let's say, for example, if you're going to display it in some sort of a display cabinet, you would want to cut it when it's drier or when it's wetter, so that as it sits, it's going to dry out. So it almost keeps for a longer period, as opposed to waiting for it to be completely dry and then wanting to cut it and display it. My personal opinion, and a lot of people will agree with me, is the best way and the best time to have biltong is as soon as it's been cut, you need to have it. So try and keep it whole for as long as possible, and cut it only when you absolutely have to, because then it's on its freshest. I get a lot of questions on how to store biltong. The best way that I've found to store it is to take your pieces once they've been taken off, once they're dry, once they're ready. You can take them, wrap them in newspaper, and put them in the freezer. And the reason for that is the paper helps to absorb excess moisture, whatever is around your biltong, and it also stops the meat from drying out any further. So when you defrost it or thaw it, you take it out and you just leave it outside, because there's not a lot of moisture in the meat itself. It'll actually defrost or thaw pretty quickly. You probably look at anything between 15 to 20, 25 minutes for a relatively decent piece. If it's thicker, obviously it'll take a little bit longer, but then you take it out and you can just leave it outside, leave it covered in the newspaper. Again, the newspaper will help to absorb some of the condensation, and that really has been the best way that I've found that you can keep biltong for longer, especially if you're going to make biltong for yourself and you want to keep it for long periods of time. Let's say people who make provision for long winters in places where it's very cold or where it's snowy. Another way in which you can do it is you could also, if you have a vacuum packing machine, you can vacuum pack your biltong and also put it in the freezer. But again, it's simple enough to just use newspaper. It works well enough. Alternatively, if you want to wrap it in newspaper and then vacuum it, you could also do that. But in general, try and cover it as much as you can, because there is still an element of moisture and you could potentially get some freezer burn on your biltong, and it takes away from the flavor and it makes your biltong stale. So the longer you keep it, and especially if you keep it open, the more you will get that sort of stale, not fresh flavor, and that's obviously not what you want. Right, I just want to say a thank you to everybody who's watched this video so far. I'm hoping that I've cleared up a lot of misconceptions and a lot of questions and a lot of unsureties when it comes to making biltong. Again, if there's any questions or queries, please feel free to drop a comment in the section below, and I'll have a look at it and I'll try and respond to as many of them as possible. And if I see there's a lot of similar queries, then I'll make a follow-up video just on that, and just clear up any questions or queries that anybody might have. So again, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.